I get this message. Please consider sharing why you ejected in this survey. One thing we found that in the year or so that Create React app has been out, and it only hit 1.0 like a month or two ago, they've changed some of the stuff that you can change without ejecting. So you rarely have to do it. You only have to do it if the built-in configuration doesn't match what you need, and there isn't already a built-in way to change that, because for certain really common things there are. So like they saw that a lot of people were doing it because they wanted to add a CSS preprocessor like Sass. And so they made it really easy to do that now. You don't have to eject in order to do that, because lots of people were ejecting to do that. So they added support for that. So that's also really nice. So let's have a look at our package.json now. And now we see our dev dependencies got a little longer. So now we're seeing some of what it was doing for us. And it added 2 new folders: scripts and config. So as we've alluded to many times, React, the way we write React with JSX and all that stuff, won't run directly in a browser. It has to go through some sort of build process to be turned into browser-ready JavaScript. It's not just a matter of minifying it so that it's fast. It just plain won't run the way we write it. And so to turn it into what we need, you need some sort of build process, which is funny for front-end code because ordinarily that's just stuff you load in a browser. But you have to use something to build it. And there are a number of tools to do that. The one that has really become the standard in React is Webpack. There are others like Browserify. But Webpack seems to have by far the most mindshare in the React world. And it's complicated to configure. And it just does it for us. So we have separate configurations for dev and production. If we look at the dev Webpack config dev.js, it is it's a 259 line file, but that's because it has a lot of comments. This is really well commented, so you can actually kind of see what some of this stuff is doing without necessarily already understanding it. But it's loading in a lot of plugins and stuff. You can get some idea of what they do. But all of this does stuff like the minification, combining things so that all the JavaScripts are in one file, so that all the CSS is in one file. There's stuff in here for that. It tells it where to output the files. It tells you where to look for includes. So if it doesn't find it in node modules, you can set another place for it to look. It can tell you, some of the default extensions for things that it should combine and minify and so on. So you could use .jsx instead of .js, but if you use some other crazy file extension, it won't know it's JavaScript and won't treat it the same way. Stuff like that. We've talked about the fact that JSX and some of the newer ECMAScript features, we're using Babel to transpile it down to earlier versions of JavaScript that things understand. So this also invokes Babel. There we go, Babel loader. And Babel itself has to be configured. There's already some CSS post-processing built into this. So for example, for some rules, there are older browser-specific variations of those rules. And it will automatically, if you use like transition, it'll automatically add like -moz-transition, the old Mozilla-specific implementation of that rule before it became standardized. It'll automatically add that rule to your style sheet so that you don't have to keep track of all those things. Stuff like that. Lots of good stuff. And then Babel itself also has some configuration. I may not have, where is that specified in here? Actually not 100% sure. Let's see if we see Babel. Babel. I bet if we read these, we'll figure out how to do it. But if you wanted to, for example, have Babel support absolutely the latest Edge ECMAScript stuff, the stuff that's in like stage 0, as a recommendation for future versions, you can tweak that, but you would have to eject in order to tweak that. Otherwise, it's just going to use the configuration that's already there. Another really common reason to do it would be to use something called CSS modules. So there are a lot of ways to deal with CSS in React. What we're doing is common and very simple. But I mentioned before, like just because we import sign out CSS inside signout.js, that doesn't do anything to actually scope those styles to this, right? We still had to rely on the fact that we gave this a certain class name, and we specified that class name inside this style sheet. That's the only thing that ensures that this style sheet only applies to this component. We were very careful to put .signout at the beginning of all our selectors. So CSS modules are one of several ways to do that sort of automatically. But you have to write your CSS a little differently, and you have to import it a little differently. And it's a whole thing, and we don't have time to cover it, but it's a cool thing to look up CSS modules. But if you wanted to add support for CSS modules in a Create React app, you would have to eject and tweak your Webpack config just a tiny bit. It's a tiny little change. You don't even need any additional dependencies, but you do have to change a piece of configuration that they haven't exposed any other way. So if you need to change any of those things that are specified in that Webpack config, that's another reason you might have to eject. Or if you didn't want some of these dependencies, you could remove some of them. Of course, if you're not importing them, they may not get rolled up in your bundle anyway, so you might not have to worry about it. But anyway, that's some of what you get for free with Create React App. Again, the README for Create React App is amazing. If you just look at the GitHub page for that project, it has the user guide, which is super detailed and really helpful, and tells you things like, how did I know they had added support for CSS preprocessors? Well, it's in the README now. Add a CSS preprocessor. And it tells you exactly what you need to do. And you don't have to eject anymore to do that. You can just change the build and watch scripts a tiny bit and add one more dependency. But if you look up how to do CSS modules, you'll find you have to eject. Or you have to add another dependency that is really, really fragile and will break your stuff. So, as you might imagine, in the 5 days or whatever that we talk about it in this class, you don't really learn React super, super thoroughly. We're scratching the surface. It's a whole big world. And among other things, Webpack config and all that stuff, it's part of it. Thank goodness for Create React App. You don't have to know it super well just to get some stuff done. But if you want to really understand it, what's going on when you run yarn build or yarn start, it's a good thing to know. Speaking of which, when we were looking at the code there a second ago, or looking at the Webpack config specifically, we saw Webpack config dev, Webpack config prod. So when you run yarn start, it's running the development server. When you run yarn build, it does the production build. So the Webpack config is a little different for that. For one thing, we have hot reloading when we're developing, right? You make a change in your code, it automatically changes the build and actually refreshes the browser for you. That stuff doesn't happen in production. If you log into the production database and start screwing around with the code that lives there, it's not going to live reload that stuff. It's not going to make another build automatically. So that's an example of what would be different from production to development. There are some configuration things you can do in Create React App by just adding a file called .env for environment. that are not super well documented. You just kind of have to either stumble across it in the code or find somebody's blog post where they say, hey, turns out you can do this cool thing and configure this without ejecting. So there are a few things like that. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what literally any of them are, but there are things like that too. But Create React App is adequate for our needs. So that's a quick look at what happens when you eject. Any questions about that? You real excited to learn about Webpack? Yeah, we're not going to do that in this class. Sir, not appearing in this class.